Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. My name is Tom Fowden, and I'm the Chair of Grand Rounds, and it's always a pleasure to see the lecture theatre full of people. I was just speaking to a couple of people outside. I said, I don't see you at Grand Rounds very often, and they said, is it all right to say that it's kind of topic dependent? Well, of course it is. I mean, if you're not that interested, I wouldn't want to drag you away from your lunch, but it is. But I think people do vote with their feet, and this is interesting to a wide range of different people. There's an anaesthetist, there's an orthopaedic surgeon, there's a GP, and we've got doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and everything in between. So no pressure, Dave. It's all going to be grand. So today we're going to hear about influenza point-of-care testing, bringing PCR to the patient. I didn't really know who was going to be speaking, so I asked Boosie just a couple of hours ago, Boosie, are you ready for the presentation? Have you got everything sorted? She tells me that the best part of doing this is delegation. So she's sitting here and has delegated to many other people, but I'm sure she'll be available at the end for some interrogation. But we're going to kick off with my friend and colleague Dave Connell, who's one of the chest consultants. He's going to talk a little bit about the background. Then Dave Ural from virology is going to speak about the nuts and bolts of flu testing. And then I think Helen is going to speak. I don't know what you're going to speak about, Helen. The audit in the process, and then it's back to Dave, and we might get Boosie up on stage. You never know. We won't get Boosie back on stage. Okay, this is the last Grand Rounds of this semester. Thank you all for coming throughout the whole semester. Next semester's programme is pretty empty, although I may have just filled in the first session by coercing one of my colleagues. But there's lots of slots. If you want to come and have 45 minutes up here to stand on your soapbox, then let me know. Orthopaedic surgeons, and we've got anaesthetists, and we've got GPs, and anybody else who's around, please come along and tell us about your service, or any research that you've done, any service developments, or just stand up here and talk for 45 minutes. Okay, so today, influenza point-of-care testing, Dave Connell.
Thanks, Tom. So thanks everyone for coming, and I'm glad it's a broad range of people in the audience today, because hopefully there'll be lots to talk about at the end. And it is a kind of a revolving door of speakers, because this was a team effort, what we're about to show. So hopefully that will reflect some of what the team did. So what we'll talk about is the background to influenza point-of-care testing this winter, the problem in capitals, like it's some kind of the problem, the winter pathway this year, point-of-care testing, which David Ural will talk about from the virological perspective, some clinical cases, pathway performance from Helen Calaby, and then the future, ... Okay, so influenza is a multi-organ syndrome caused by an influenza virus, okay, and that's important to remember. It's not just about respiratory medicine, but it is mainly about respiratory medicine, as most things are. But it can, of course, affect the brain, the heart. Pregnancy is important. I know we've got people from obstetric anaesthesia here today, and musculoskeletal. But we obviously see most of the disease, I think, from the respiratory or the upper respiratory tract, and that's because influenza viruses, and this is a diagram of one, we'll look at it in more detail in a second, affect epithelial cells of the respiratory tract, and that's often how they present to primary and secondary care. So influenza is a syndrome caused by one of several influenza viruses. There's influenza viruses A to D. I didn't know that. I knew of A and B, but C and D also exist. David's looking at me there as if, of course, you idiot. But influenza A is most important, I think, because it can affect multiple different hosts, including humans, ferrets, birds, poultry, pigs, and so on, and has got most pandemic potential. The virus itself is composed of, it's an RNA virus, RNA nucleoprotein surrounded with an envelope, and these surface proteins, and you'll have heard of them, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, and these are the ones that give us the H and the N of H1N1, H3N9, and so on and so forth, and that's how we determine what the most relevant circulating influenza virus is per season. There are other important proteins like the M2 and M1, which are core proteins involved in injecting the virus particle into the epithelial cells. Okay, so some data. So these are data from Scottish Government showing what has happened over the last few years in terms of influenza cases in the country, not just in the hospital. So you can see this big spike here is a reference to 2010-11. And in the years following that, there wasn't much influenza activity until 2017-18, and that's that black line there. So last winter, you might remember, it was busy. The hospital was full of people with flu-like symptoms and flu. That was reflected in what happened in hospitals in Scotland. So if you just go back to it, I should say that the ILI rate last year was about 150 cases per 100,000, and ILI means influenza-like illness. Now, in hospital, we were seeing last year about 1,000 admissions with influenza across Scotland, but you can see that was a lot more than in the years before. And not just in hospital, but in critical care too. And I know that Sean McCartney is here from intensive care, and the red bars here with the black line is what happened last year in ICU, HDU in Scotland. And you can see in comparison to 2015-16 and 2016-17, there were many more cases, and that was hundreds of cases going to intensive care and HDU across Scotland. So last winter was busy. And this is reflected by what happened here at Tayside. So those of us who were working over Christmas 2017-18, that spike is what it felt like. Suddenly a huge spike in respiratory admissions and a huge spike in boarding beds from AMU. So these are medical patients where there is no space to place them within medicine. And these are patients who ended up on oncology wards, haematology wards and surgical wards. And the spike going up here with boarding beds and with respiratory admissions means that most of these patients were under respiratory, and Will Anderson is looking tired still from last winter. And the result of that was lots of cancelled operations. Okay, so last winter was bad in primary care across Scotland, bad in secondary care across Scotland, bad in critical care across Scotland, and bad in 9 wells in medicine, in respiratory, and bad for surgery as well. And this hit the headlines. So last winter, flu outbreak, UK deaths triple with GP seeing major rise in patients. Apparently, actually, when they analysed it, those increasing deaths weren't all really due to flu, but that was what was reported at the time. So there was a significant burden of influenza in secondary care as well as primary care in 2017-18, with medical and surgical implications here in Tayside. There was a higher critical care burden, and as a result there were significant impacts on our hospital's flow and performance. So the question, which came really from the Winter Planning Committee, what could be done or what should be done in 2018-19. So a diversion briefly. This is the RESPOC study out of Southampton, which was I think published 2016-17. And this was using point-of-care testing for respiratory viruses in adults presenting to hospital. And the RESPOC study showed that if you used a PCR-based respiratory virus testing strategy at the bedside, there were more, inverted commas, shorter courses of antibiotics. So people still got given antibiotics, but the courses were shorter because presumably they were stopping them earlier. There was a reduced length of stay, and there was better use of antivirals. So this is an attractive thing for a hospital which is seeing lots of respiratory illness, which is having impacts upon its flow. So what were we doing last winter? So we had people with suspected influenza. We made a kind of a generic, are they well or are they unwell? What does that mean? I don't really know. Some people we treated, gave them Tamiflu and sent them home, and occasionally we'd send a confirmatory test. Other people who we felt were unwell, however we were defining that, we'd admit them, we'd stick them in a side room, we'd send a test, and then 24 hours later we'd get the result back. We'd pull them out the side room and send them home, maybe stop the Russell-Tamivir, or we might continue. So there's huge potential for using point-of-care testing somewhere along this pathway, or this, it's not really a pathway, it's sort of a series of diagnostic decisions to try and improve flow and decision-making. So that's the kind of background to where we were at the start of the winter that's just gone. So what might we improve with a point-of-care test? We might reduce the inappropriate use of antivirals in individuals who don't have flu, and we might save some money, and we might reduce some side effects by doing that. So also Tamivir doesn't have many side effects. It does give you bad dreams, but there's a potential improvement there. We might use fewer antibiotics, and that might save us money. It might save people having side effects, and it would obviously help reduce antimicrobial resistance. We might be able to use our isolation facilities and our side rooms better, with maybe early isolation of the highest risk patients, i.e. those with influenza A, which has got most pandemic potential. And we might be able to improve patient flow through medicine and our bed usage and maybe have fewer operations cancelled. And to take a quote from Bill Clinton, it's not the economy stupid, it's the whole system stupid. It's not just about a fancy box, it's about trying to improve the whole system approach to flu. So on the basis of that, there was a point of care working group set up in late September, and the problem is late September 2018 doesn't give you much time before flu hits. So we have 2 months to get going, and in this working group we had acute medicine, we had respiratory, we had infectious diseases, nursing, virology and infection control. And although we didn't have anyone from primary care there, some members of this group liaised with them. And we focused on 5 things really: how we might generate an influenza-like illness pathway, how we might train staff to use this pathway and a potential point-of-care delivery system, which had to be agreed upon, validated and put into place, how might we collect data on improving system flow. So instead of having this, we generated this. Okay, so this is a much more complicated pathway. I'm not going to obviously talk about all of it now, but it was a pathway which we thought quite hard about. And the key thing was, first of all, was to define what we thought flu was, or what flu might be. So people went and they looked at what the Scottish Government said, this might be flu, and then we would use that in our definition. We would try and keep people in the community. So people who were well, we would try and ask GPs to have objective markers of their wellness, instead of just saying, are they sick or are they not sick? We say, well, what's their news score? Do you think they might be suitable for community investigation? And actually try and keep them there instead of bringing them to hospital. Those people who came to hospital, we had early testing, and if they were sick, we'd move them into a side room. And then we'd have a test that would allow us to have a diagnosis within 20 minutes and then go on from there. And I'm not going to go through the pathway because it's a bit boring. Will Anderson generated a mini guide for managing ILI in primary care, and this went out to GPs across Tayside to really try and focus people's minds on that not everyone with suspected flu needed to come to hospital. And that's where we started. So that's how we generated a pathway. The next thing is really what kind of machine could we use to diagnose flu at the bedside. And David Euro is going to talk about that now.
Right, so this is very much from the lab point of view and how we saw it, what we did. As a bit of background, our normal winter service, we do PCR 5 days a week normally, but from November to April we have a 6-day PCR respiratory system in place where we also do norovirus, but mainly it's for respiratory. And we detect a whole range of different viruses, flu A, B, RSV, 4 sorts of paraflu, 4 sorts of corona, human metapneumo, adeno-entero, mycoplasma pneumoniae and rhinovirus. So we have quite a lot we pull out of each thing. And we have a system whereby specimens that arrive before 1 o'clock on the weekdays and before 11 o'clock on a Saturday will get resulted the same day. So it's a quick, slick 24-hour service. But it also means that any specimen arriving after 11 o'clock on a Saturday, you don't eventually get a result until Monday afternoon. So there is a gap there. And really, the 24-hour turnaround is pretty good, but it's a bit too slow for bed management. And what we ended up was with a system for bed management, not necessarily for diagnosis, but for bed management. That's what the aim of the system ended up being. So going back to the timelines, as David said, September we got the go-ahead to look at point-of-care testing, and September is quite late. Those of us who have been around a bit will know that flu can arrive as early as October, beginning of November, usually around December, so didn't give us a lot of time to get things in place. We had to surf around and look at several manufacturers of point-of-care systems. There's not just one, there's several. And they tend to divide themselves in between 2 sorts. One that gives you a big range of targets, almost equivalent to what we produce in the lab, or you can have a narrow range for just flu and RSV. And early on the decision was we're quite happy to do with just flu and RSV because this is for management and it's not so much for absolute diagnosis. you get what you pay for, so the wide range actually costs more as well, and it usually takes longer to do. So flu and RSV is a good way of approaching this for speed and ease of use. And ease of use and speed were very important. These were going to be used by non-lab trained individuals, so we had to be easy to use and quick. Otherwise, if it wasn't quick, there wouldn't be much point of doing it next to the patient. You could just send a sample off to the lab. So it's got to be quick, efficient, and easy to use. And we really wanted it connected to our laboratory information system as well, the LIMS system, which is quite important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it connects to the patient record, so the results from the point of care actually enter the patient record. You have a history there, as opposed to just losing that somewhere in the ether. And it also, our LIMS system provides feeds to other electronic data gathering systems, like infection control and for national things through HPS, whereby they look at the national data. Those pull directly off our LIMS system. So if the thing doesn't go into our LIMS, the Scottish Government don't get wind of what's happening on a national basis. And we did have some outline, some guidance for this. There is a Scottish advisory statement on how you should put point of care in, and that flags up the connection to the LIMS as one of the major points. And this is Scotland. It's available on the Health Protection website. It's also got picked up by Public Health England, so they refer to it as well. And also we had to take into account cost. There was a certain amount of money that was going to have to cover everything, so cheaper is better. So we ended up with this, which is a dinky little machine. Let me see that. No, can't. I don't think that's working. Okay, this is the cartridge that loads, and you stick it in the little machine, which is produced by Roche. It's called the reliant system, and it measures flu A, flu B, and RSV, and it does it in 20 minutes, which is very quick. And it does one specimen at a time. And one good thing about it, it uses our normal viral transport medium. So that means after you've done a point of care, you can send the residual off to the lab, and we can do further testing if and when is required. So you don't lose the specimen from a full range if that's what you want. And people were encouraged to, if they did want the full range after a negative point of care test, to email us, and we would put it through the whole system. And we wanted it linked to the LIMS, and they promised it would. But like many of these things, it never quite came to fruition. It wasn't through lack of trying, either by the company or us, but I think the problem lays with eHealth and their firewalls and things like this. But it was halfway to the LIMS. We could access the data through a PC, but then we had to manually enter that into our LIMS system. So there was a chance for typographical errors and things there, and it also meant we had to go and look for the specimen and identify it to the patient. And we could do that when we received the residual specimen into the lab. We could then go and look for it. As we said earlier, we don't just believe companies when they sell us stuff. We're very unsure about all their sales. So we always do a validation of our assays. And because of the lack of time, we could only do a relatively small validation, and we used stored specimens from the previous winter, which again are not ideal specimens because they've already been frozen and thawed. But 93% of the tests were valid, so we got a good result on 93% of the specimens, slightly lower than we'd like, but we accepted that. But the sensitivity and specificity for flu was 100%, and with RSV, it only threw up one false positive in the whole lot, and really is pretty good. It detects not only the H1 and the H3, which is the normal sort of flus that you'd expect around, it also picks up H5 and H7, which are the scary flu, avian flus that kill people. So we like to pick those up, but we can't tell the difference between them with this particular assay. So we can't tell what sort of type of flu it is. We need to do further tests to check on that. Anyway, from our validation point of view, we thought it was good enough, and so they installed one machine in Ninewells and one machine in PRI in December. So from the end of September to middle of December, this was all done, which is a pretty good turnaround. And as you can see, this is where it is, positioned here. It is a dinky little machine. It really is small and very effective. It's got barcode readers and it's got its little computer screen, so there's no PC or laptop to go with it. So it fits in all over the place. And then there's, as you can see on the walls, telling people how to use it and how to take a swab. And it was Christmas, so they had Merry Christmas up there too. Okay. Problems. There were problems, clearly. And looking back, there were point-of-care specimens were not sent to the lab. So we didn't even know they were taken. Okay. That was our flag up that a point-of-care test had been done. We should look for a result. We should put that into our LIMS system. If they didn't send the specimens, we didn't know it had happened. We had agreed to use the Chi number as the identification on patients, and about 1/10 of all the specimens had the ICE number used instead of the Chi. And that made it very difficult for us to identify individuals. We had to go searching in systems and all sorts to identify the individual. Incorrect Chi used. They weren't always barcoded in. Sometimes they were manually put into the machine. Chi's are not easy numbers to get right every time. People get them wrong. And that means when we get a conflict between the Chi on the sample, the Chi from the result, we don't know which particular person that referred to, so we couldn't link that to the patient record. Okay? We don't take a chance, oh yeah, it's probably right, we'll put it in. We don't do that. And there were made-up Chi's. People put made-up numbers in. Okay? And we wonder whether that was testing members of staff who really didn't want to be identified at the time, but so there were a number of 10 stars put down, and that was their Chi. Repeat testing of point of care. There were about 30 specimens, not that many, 30 specimens, patients that were retested by point of care. One person had 4 point of care tests within a 24-hour period. It happens, I understand, but slight waste of resources. And also individuals selecting point of care test and the lab test at the same time. So we get a specimen into the lab, we test it, and then we go, oh, it was tested point of care as well, and guess what? We both got it flu positive or negative. So again, slight waste of resources. If you're going to do one, don't do the other. And people logging in wrong. We had the machines were set up so individuals had to log in to use them. We knew who used them at any one time. Some people logged in as administrator rather than themselves, so they were keeping themselves secret. And there was a problem with supply and storage of kits. The lab's not set up for large storage facilities, so there was lots of running up and downstairs to supply the ward with kits. So how busy were we this year? We said last year it was a busy year, and if you look at just the blue line here, we've got December, January and February previous winter, and you could see about 350, 400 flu positives per month in the lab, okay, in December and January, which were the peak months. This year, January and February, it was about half that number. So it was a quieter year than previous years. But you never know what the year's going to be like until you get there, okay? So it's about half as busy as last year. Yeah. And this is another heat graph that was like the one shown earlier in the talk. This one is just for Tayside, and you can see this is the previous winter, 2017-18. These are banded into low levels, moderate levels, high levels, and oh my God, what's going on here levels. So that was the previous winter was getting close to head for the hills and shut up and go home. But the red line is this year's, and you can see it was a much lower level. This is national data from Health Protection Scotland. So how many positives, how many negatives? Again, this is the big winter, 17-18, about 1,000 positives and about 1/10 of those RSV. So that's flu positives, RSV positive and negatives. If you look at this year, this is the total for the lab and for the point of care. About the same number of negatives, so you're testing quite a few people, far fewer flu positives, a bit more RSV this year. It was a bigger RSV year than last year, and this was the contribution of the point of care. So again, we got identified about half the positive flus with the point of care test, and yet we didn't test half the individuals. So your pathway picked out the positives quite well, fewer as a percentage of RSV, but these figures don't include paediatrics where most of the RSV is located. So, what did we miss? By testing for flu and RSV alone, what viruses did we miss? Well, we haven't tested the ones that were done by point of care yet this year. We hope to do that later. But this is based on what we got in the lab and what ones came up with other viruses. So last winter there was a big peak of coronaviruses, but mainly you get rhinoviruses and human metapneumoviruses. And this year, seeing as these figures don't include the point of care results, you can see we had at least as much, if not possibly more, other viruses floating around than we did last year. Just because it's a big flu year doesn't mean anything else in the landscape changes. There's the background level of rhinoviruses and all the other things, the coughs and splutters and snotty-nosed kids. The question is, does it matter and do we care that we missed those diagnoses? As a person who's interested in diagnosis, I would say, yes, I want to know, but did it actually affect patient care? Did it affect anything very much? So these are just the figures. If we just look at the first two bars, which are 9 Wells numbers, in December when we first put them in, you got 92 samples tested in the lab and a fewer number tested by point of care, because it was late in December when we first put them in. And then you can see that in January and February, the numbers switch around, very few tested in the lab compared to the number tested by point of care. Now, out of all those testing, there were less than 10 occurrences where we got an email saying, could you test for all the other stuff? So clinically, people weren't demanding all these negatives, could you test them please? They were just accepting they were negative, they weren't flu, they weren't RSV, deal with it. Now, on different wards, that may be different. In oncology, in paediatrics, that may be a different kettle of fish, that you want to know what other things are around. But perhaps on the way in, it's a debate for next season. Do we want to do more than that by point of care, or is flu and RSV okay on its own? So lessons for next year, this is again from the viewpoint of the lab. We need to start planning earlier. It was a rush this year, it was an unnecessary rush really. If we're going to do it, let's plan a bit earlier, and then we can do more engagement, we can do more training before we get started. We can assess the tests better and have all the LIMS systems set up as well. We need the LIMS connection. The chances of making an error when you're managed transcribing things once on the ward and then once in the lab, there's a great chance of getting stuff wrong. We need more than one contact between lab and the ward, because sometimes people aren't there, they're off sick, they're on a different shift. We need to basically stick to agreed protocols. Things work so much better if you just do what you're told. We need some more fridge and storage space on the ward, because we need to store the kits and not be running up and down supplying it. And if any managers are here, this is just really for you, that this doesn't actually save any time in the lab. If anything, it takes up more time. So you're not going to save anything on our costs. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, David. So I thought next we'd just look at some clinical cases and also then some feedback from some of the users. The clinical cases, I think there are 4 cases, and they all arrived. They all seen by me and AMU within 48 hours. I think they all came in over around 2 days. So case 1. This was a woman who was usually well in middle age, short history of an upper respiratory tract infection, a dry cough and a fever. She was lymphopenic and had a CRP of 72 and otherwise well. Now, a chest radiograph suggested perhaps, the red light has got, no, it's still there, perhaps some consolidation at the left base. She had an influenza-like illness, but she was well. We did a point of care test. She was flu A positive. And she was well enough to go home. So we sent her home with some oseltamivir. She'd presented within 48 hours of onset of symptoms. Because she had some consolidation, we gave her some standby antibiotics, but we felt that we wouldn't need to treat her up front. She didn't use them, and she got better without them. So this was someone who was discharged early from ambulatory assessment with a diagnosis, who didn't need antibiotics. I think last year we would have been concerned, was this flu, was this not flu, swab, wait 24 hours and send home with antibiotics perhaps. Hard to know, but that's my feeling. Case 2. This was a middle-aged man, usually well, short history of cough and confusion, and as you recall, influenza is a multi-system disorder. He was febrile and confused, lymphopenic like our first case. Platelets were also low. He had an elevated troponin suggestive of a myocarditis and a CRP of 114. His CK was up, consistent with a myositis, and his ALT was up as well. He had consolidation at his right base, so this felt like influenza with a multi-system presentation, but he was point-of-care negative. We didn't have to use a side room for this man. We investigated him aggressively for a multi-organ atypical pneumonia. Eventually he got better with some antibiotics, but the advantage of the point-of-care test in this situation, early knowledge this was not influenza, drove us to look harder for another diagnosis. Case 3, someone who was usually well, 24 hours of high fevers and rigors, no symptoms of a flu-like illness, lymphopenic with a CRP of 66 and a normal chest radiograph. Concern here was this very early sepsis, but this patient was flu A positive. And again, we managed through the ambulatory assessment area, send them home with Tamiflu. It's always difficult, it might still be sepsis, but knowing it's flu, I think, changed people's confidence at sending patients home, and I know speaking to colleagues that they were doing this. And case 4. This was a man on secukinumab. It's an anti-IL-17 monoclonal antibody for psoriatic arthropathy. Short history of a respiratory tract infection. He was lymphopenic but had a very high CRP, a kidney injury, and he was hypoxemic, so he had type 1 respiratory failure. He had a multilobar pneumonia, and we would, of course, define this as a severe community-acquired pneumonia, but he was point-of-care test flu positive. His procalcitonin was low, and this was tested when he ended up in intensive care, but his HIV test was negative, and his Legionella urinary antigen was negative. He got worse, was transferred to HDU and then ICU. And this man was given intravenous zanamivir in the end, broad-spectrum antibiotics. And this case flagged to us the fact that we probably weren't managing our severe influenzas in a coordinated fashion. We'll maybe come back to that at the end. And we've already started discussing how we might change that next year. It also flagged up the fact that we now know that invasive aspergillosis is increasingly recognised to complicate severe influenza. So these data are from groups from the Netherlands and Belgium, and in their data set, up to 20% of patients with severe influenza in critical care are co-infected with invasive aspergillosis, which you would treat with parenteral antifungals. And that risk of invasive aspergillosis goes up to about 35% in people who are immunocompromised, as this man was. So we hummed and hawed about giving this man antifungals. We got a serum BD-glucan and galactomannan back, which were negative, but we got them back a week later, so not the most useful diagnostic test in this situation. But the early diagnosis of severe flu might allow, perhaps not in this man, but I think for next season, use of restricted intravenous antivirals and looking hard for secondary infections. So those are just 4 cases over 24, 48 hours of people coming through the front door where I found the point-of-care test useful. So asking colleagues what they felt, here's some not made-up quotes, these are genuinely what people said. Early information facilitated discharge and flow. People felt it might have helped prevent ward and bay closures. Our hit rate was good, so our hit rate was about 30%. So if we thought someone had an influenza-like illness, our swab was sent. It was around 30% were positive for influenza or RSV through January and February, and that ultimately was one of the reasons that we stopped testing in March, was that our hit rate dropped about 3% over the course of a week, so we decided to stop. If you looked at last year, before we had point of care in a very busy flu year, I think it was about 40% were positive from the lab-based tests. So fewer positive tests this year, as you'd expect in a less busy year, but I think 30% is not unreasonable. The nursing staff and the AMU team and the research team, I think, flagged that there was some pretty good teamwork in setting up the whole system and in the use of the system. One of my colleagues thought we might have stopped too soon, and that's always a difficult decision, because I think in the week after we stopped there were a few flu cases that we didn't know about, but that's, of course, a risk. One of the nurses said, I'm gutted that it's gone. So we'll have to plan for next year. And some people said, were we over-testing? And I think that's always a difficult thing to know. Someone also thought the staff seemed healthier. Maybe that was because we vaccinated more people this year, but maybe we were isolating people with flu earlier. Who knows? Okay. So along the way, we decided in advance that we were going to try and analyse the use of our pathway with some audit. Helen Calaby will talk to us about that now.
Hi, so I'm Helen, one of the core trainees. So my role in this with one of my colleagues, Bill Turner, who's one of the other CMTs, was really looking at sort of an audit quality improvement type project. So to look at collecting the data and seeing whether we actually made a difference in terms of patient flow. So the way that we decided to do this was to get the nursing staff on AMU to complete what we called a yellow form, and that was the data collection looking at the admission time, the time to the point of care test performance, the time of discharge from AMU decisions, so what time were they seen, looked at the point of care test result and a decision made about omission of discharge, and then time of actual discharge from AMU. So we ran the data collection from the 22nd of December to the 28th of February, and in that time we had 552 yellow forms completed, which we logged and analysed the results from. So that obviously there's a little bit of a difference between the data there and the actual swabs that were sent to the lab, so that could be some swabs that weren't sent, and also this is just the 9 wells data rather than the PRI data as well. So we looked at the virus positives. So in all of the data, we found that 28% of them were positive, whether that was A, B, or RSV, and that figure is kind of in keeping with the figure that was analysed from the labs as well. And in terms of virus breakdown, 80% of them were flu A, flu B was just one of them, and RSV was about 19%. In the yellow form that we asked the nurses to complete, we asked them to say whether their news was less than or equal to 4 or greater than 4. About 50% were less than 4, a third were greater than 4, and some of them weren't filled out. So this was the yellow form. I don't know if it projects very well. We printed it on yellow paper so that we could keep an eye out for it on the notes. As you can see, there's quite a lot of information that we wanted to be filled out on there. So we tried to look at the symptoms that people had. We tried to look at whether the point of care test was positive or negative. And then the important things that we were trying to focus on was the time that the discharge decisions were made and the discharge destinations. So in terms of patient flow, we found that our average time to point of care testing, so from the point that the patients came in to the point that they had their point of care test done, was about 5 hours 51 minutes, and that was based on 85% feedback. So 85% of the yellow forms were completed on that question alone. The rest of the data is quite hard to extrapolate from, obviously because it's quite a complicated, long form. Only 7 or 8% of them actually had the form completed the whole way through. So for the 7% that were completed, the time from admission to a discharge decision being made was 9 hours, and the average time to actual discharge from AMU was 10 hours and 30 minutes. So we then tried to analyse a little bit about the symptom profile, looking at exactly which patients were having flu testing and what criteria kind of triggered a flu test to fit in with the pathway. This is, as you can see, a wide range of symptoms, which is in keeping with influenza-like illnesses. And we found that probably cough and sore throat were a little bit more prominent for flu A, but overall no real symptoms stood out as favouring a certain virus. The other thing that we looked at was whether patients that had a point of care test were then more or less likely to get either Tamiflu or any other antimicrobial. The data we've done for this is the number of agents rather than the percentage, because some people were given Tamiflu and antibiotics, so when we did it as a percentage it tended to skew the data a little bit. We found that Tamiflu was almost exclusively given in point of care test positive patients, which is obviously reassuring. One lot of Tamiflu was given in a negative point of care test, but there was documented on the form that they were presuming that it was metapneumovirus, and I think they went on to have further testing for that. We can see that there's probably reduced diversity of antibiotics that are used in point of care test positive patients, and that's probably in keeping with clinicians thinking they have flu or a lower respiratory tract infection, so there's less use of sort of ceftriaxone, acyclovir. We looked a little bit with some data from the antimicrobial pharmacy team about whether the point of care testing reduced our use of Tamiflu this year. So if you can see that last year there was about 1.03 capsules of Tamiflu in AMU per positive flu swab, and this year it was slightly less at 0.86 capsules per positive flu swab. So we couldn't extrapolate that much from the data due to the incompleteness of the yellow forms, but anecdotally it was felt within the department that the point of care testing sped up the patient's journey through AMU. We had a chat with the staff that were filling out the yellow form, and it was felt that the data collection form was too complex and required too much inputting of data at different time points. So it needed data inputted when the person first came in, what time they arrived, what time the flu test was done, then they were probably reviewed by a junior or a middle grade, and then reviewed by a senior. So by the time that patient's journey goes on, it's often different nursing staff completing the yellow form. So we asked them what they thought about the point of care test themselves, and staff seemed to think that it led to a quicker discharge, that there was much less wait than there was for a result from a traditional throat swab, and some of them thought that the machine seemed to error occasionally. And then we asked them what they thought about the yellow form specifically and having to fill that out. They felt that having to repeatedly come back to the form wasn't useful, so it was kept at the flu machine rather than in the notes, because we didn't want the yellow forms to get sort of dissipated around the hospital. So having to keep coming back to it meant that it was forgotten about and sometimes not filled in. Some people thought it was a faff. They could easily fill in the first section, but it was difficult to come back to, particularly if the nurses had handed over. They wouldn't be aware that a yellow form had even been started. Some people thought it was straightforward to understand. So in conclusion, we felt that it did make a positive impact to patient flow, but we're let down by the limitations of the current methods of tracking patient flow. And if we were to do it again next year, then we need to look into sort of better tools in order to track the flow, and whether there'd be any sort of IT systems like TrackCare that would be able to facilitate that a little bit better.
Thanks, Helen. So just to finish up, really, I think we all felt that the point of care test was useful and well received. But I think in all these things, a pathway is as important as the machine. And it was a pathway that took quite a long time to put together, but I think in the end it worked quite well. Looking at the oseltamivir data, we certainly used less per head of flu than we did the year before, so it probably has rationalised some antiviral use. That would have saved some money. And it might have improved flow through medicine. Obviously, we had a better winter this year. We know we had a lot less boarding. I don't have that data, but it was a less busy year. Being able to definitively show that flow has improved was difficult, as Helen alludes to, and that's part of the challenge with the way that we track our patients in general through the hospital, particularly when they arrive in AMU. And I think earlier planning will allow us to understand the flow improvements and cost savings next year more accurately. So what we're going to do next, David Urrell in the virology lab, we're going to test the safe samples, first of all to make sure that there was some agreement with the point of care test and what the lab would have said. I think we spotted midway through the season that we've got a kind of a lacunae in what we do in terms of severe flu. Lots of the patients might go straight from ED to ICU. It was only halfway through the season really that ICU found out that knew that we had the point of care test, and we were able to help them with that. So I think we've already started speaking about having a more integrated approach to severe flu and critical care, and that might include intravenous antivirals and a plan for how we would screen for invasive aspergillosis in these patients. Again, midway through the season, I started having discussions with colleagues in obstetrics because, of course, we were restricting this use to AMU because of our concern about using it for patient flow. But, of course, obstetrics have a group of patients who, when they get flu, often get it in a more severe way. And infection control within maternity is really, really important. So I think in our next lot of planning, we need to factor in how we might be able to help colleagues in obstetrics and haematology and oncology if that's what they want. I mean, to start planning now. Thanks.
Right, lovely. Thanks very much to all of you for that. Any questions or comments from the audience? Just I boot this microphone up. Okay.
No, it's a question, not an opinion. I mean, that was all very interesting and I was pleased to hear about it. My question was, so you only had about 7% of the forms with the time to decision and time to discharge completed, but the question really was that was about 10 hours, but what are we aiming for and what's the norm and what can we compare it to know whether it's actually improved flow or not?
Dave.
I've been nominated. So one way to look at this would be to look at what happened last year to patients with influenza as a comparison to say, what was time to discharge, time to decision to discharge in patients with ILI last year. And we can do that. That would be a lot of work. And that's something that we can do. Your question, what's best practice? We have in AMU a 30-bedded unit for 45 to 60 admissions a year, and in winter, 45 to 60 admissions a day, and in winter usually 60 admissions a day. So we need to be making decisions to discharge within 12 hours in most patients. The problem last year was we were making decisions to discharge or to move on without the flu information. So I guess we might find that last year that we're not discharging people or moving them off AMU more quickly, but we're moving them off to not a side room or to a side room more appropriately. And that might be the question we need to ask. It's not so much how quickly they're moving, but is the destination the most appropriate?
Actually, with the 60-minute bundle work that we've done a lot of work with the data department, and the difficulty is that there's just so many different systems. So the labs use one system, radiology use another system, and then we use track care. But actually we have found a way of amalgamating those systems with the work that we've done on the 60-minute bundle. So I'm sure that we can do that automatically, actually, to compare these 2 years and the next year.
Who did the testing in the AMU? Was it doctors, nurses?
So we made a decision really early on.
It's me. I did it all.
No. We made a decision really early to not let doctors near it. Doctors bugger things up. They maverick. They do things their own way. They refuse to follow protocols and guidelines because they know better. So we decided that we wouldn't do that, and we trained up as many of the nursing staff and HCAs as we could. And Cameron Ruff, I don't know if he's here. Is he here? No. Was really instrumental in doing that, and he kept a log of who was trained. There was a brief period, I think a couple of days early on, where we didn't have quite enough trained staff on the unit in a 24-hour period to do it. But quite quickly we got over that. But yeah, if we were going to do it again, we'd carry on with that protocol of not training doctors.
Yeah, so if we add our obstetric patients to that group, that would mean you would need to have a few more nurses to be trained up to make
or
that...
midwives.
Yeah.
That's real enthusiasm there.
That's a possibility, yeah, you're absolutely right. Another thing, just with the connectivity, I've been in touch with Blood Science recently about another point-of-care testing device, and I think they're purchasing, kind of centralizing software program from a company called Werfen, and they can add on other point-of-care devices to make it a connection to eyes and all the other lab systems. So that's maybe something worth considering. It will cost extra money if it's not from the same company, but it can take other point-of-care devices.
One of the reasons we chose the system that we're using is because Roche supply other point-of-care tests, and we are reassured that they also have a middleware whereby they can plug in any point-of-care test in this, and magically it would arrive in our system. But like all these things, they're far more complex than I know about. And like I say, I think it was at our end that is held up through eHealth, otherwise it would have been put in place.
I would say actually an amazing amount of work by the lab. With all these things, one always expects it just not to work because things never work, but this really did actually work from pretty much the get-go, and I know lots of work from Jeanette and Geraldine and David in virology to make it work was really impressive.
How much does it cost?
So a test was 30... Jeanette? £30, yeah. So we got the machine for free on loan. So we spent about £38,500 this winter doing this. Of course, we would have tested more patients anyway. So remember, it's not £38,000, it's £38,000 where that's not using lab tests. But that's what it cost us. The machine was free. It might not be free in the future, though.
How much is the lab test?
Again, difficult to give an exact figure because you do batches, you do numbers, you don't do one at a time. So it's how many you're doing at a time. But it's less than that. A lab test is less than that. But for a lab, you have to add in the work time, people's time, whereas in this calculation, you're not looking at people's time. So it's not really apples with apples.
So we got this money as part of the winter plan. It would have been really great to be able to show we have saved X many bed days, and therefore we've come out in the black here. We feel that we have made an improvement, but in actually showing it, that just, I think, shows the kind of the deficiencies of our data collection in general at 9 Wales. So I think next year we'll have more time to plan. It would be great to be able to show that doing this in some way saves us flow. I mean, I think when you ask clinicians, they feel it was useful.
Yeah, I think you're underselling this, Dave. We've significantly reduced our bed base in 9 Wales Hospital in the last however many months. And the measure I think that you haven't put up there is how many times bays and wards were shut because of this. And I think there was only one in the whole course of the winter period this year. Of bay, that is, rather not a ward. Stand to be corrected, but I think that's what it is. Where even in the non-peak years of flu, we've had multiple bay closures and multiple ward closures where we had loads more beds. So it's very much about directing the patients to the right place, whether they need isolation or not. The other comment I just wanted to make was on the all the other viruses bit. So we made a decision up front about not wanting to know what they are, and that is where maverick doctors do make these kinds of decisions on a risk-benefit basis. But I think it was the right one, and I think we were successful.
It was Schrodinger's virus. There were viruses there. We don't know if, well, there may have been viruses. We don't know what sort. We'll know. David will tell us what we were missing, but we made a decision that we didn't want to know. And we would definitely, therefore, have been having patients in bays who may have had coronavirus, metapneumovirus, and so on. But we felt that was, we had to justify the appropriate use of syndromes by focusing on flu A, then flu B, and RSV.
I'm stuck.
And infection control are sat there at the back saying, yeah, there's always a dichotomy between what is ideal and what is necessary.
Okay. The Glaswegians went the other way and went the whole hog. They did the whole raft of 35 different viruses. Come on, Boosie, you want to comment? Come on.
The problem with testing for all of these viruses in a coughing patient is what then? And you may actually end up in requiring more beds because you have to isolate people for viruses that you've now found that you would previously not even have looked for and not isolated patients for. So we took the head in the sand approach.
Yeah. The Queen Elizabeth Death Star Hospital, of course, is all side routes. Yeah. So it's easy enough for them to isolate because they isolate them anyways, which brings the question of why test if you're going to isolate anyway.
One thing about Glasgow, I think they used about 20 of these reliant tests, so they were using this, whereas someone like Inverness have put in place in their remote hospitals, they've put their full works in there, so they get about 20 or 30 targets on their more obscure hospitals further away from the lab.
Okay, we done? No more comments? That's excellent. Right. Okay, thanks very much for coming. Thanks for coming all semester. Thanks to everyone who spoke. Thanks to the team here today. And we start again on the 5th of May. So you have a whole month off. 5th of May with something. I'll tell you close to the day. Okay, thanks very much, and thanks to all the team again.